Next, from the Union League Club of Chicago, Governor Scott Walker of Wisconsin talks about his recent efforts to balance his state budget and his clash with unions over their representation of state workers.
I was thinking as I came down last night, and last night we had a little gathering. As you mentioned, it was a year ago, literally yesterday I was elected. It also happened to be my birthday, so I had a little birthday cake, and then came on down late last night so I could join with you early this morning and beat the traffic on the way in. And I thought, well, how can a guy from Wisconsin who's a Green Bay Packers fan connect with people in Chicago, right? Well, I thought well, no, you got to hear what I'm going to say. We can commiserate because we can all pick on the Minnesota Vikings, right? I mean, I love telling my friends across the St. Croix River, you know why the Minnesota Vikings and a car thief are alike? Neither of them has a title. Or these days I get to tell one about the Vikings. I used to tell about the Lions. I can't do that anymore. And I said, you know why the Minnesota Vikings don't have a website? It's because they can't put 3 W's in a row. The best one, though, takes a second to tell. And any of you who are owners of a tavern or establishment or just go to one, which probably includes everyone in the room, so you know the guy who goes into a bar and he's got his dog with him, and the bartender says, we can't serve a dog here, you got to leave. And he says, oh, he's a Minnesota Vikings fan, you got to let him in, the game's on, we got to do this, it's a tradition. He says, okay, but you got to sit way down at the end of the bar away from all the other patrons. He says, okay, marches down the field as they're watching the TV, and the Vikings are getting closer, and they get in the red zone, and finally they kick a field goal. The ball goes up, it goes through the goalpost. The dog jumps up down, and the bar stool starts howling, and all excited, and the bartender comes down to the owner of the dog, and he says, man, I'm sorry. I had no idea. I thought you were completely joking about that. Your dog gets that excited over a field goal. What does he do for a touchdown? The guy stops and thinks for a moment, and he goes, I don't know. I've only had him for 2 years. So we can share that, something in common between Bears and Vikings fans, a dislike for the Minnesota Vikings. I said a few years back when Brett Favre left, that was tough for all of us, although not so tough after the Super Bowl victory with Aaron Rodgers this year, but it was tough for us at the time. And Brett went off to the Jets, and I said, that's kind of like, if you got some friends, somebody went through a divorce, but it's amicable. They've got kids, they make it work out. Somehow we made it work out. When Brett went to the Vikings, that's like a divorce. You get divorced and then you marry your sister-in-law. That just is not right. It's just not a right thing. So we're glad that's passed and we moved on in the whole bit. But aside from a lot these days when people ask me, well, things are going in Wisconsin, I spend the first couple minutes, as we did this morning, talking about sports and certainly the Packers. In the larger context, what I like to tell about is how our reforms are working. And that's really a good story to tell here and anywhere else across the country, because I think it's shed some light on the future, not only Wisconsin, but on our individual states elsewhere, and really about our country and the challenges we face in Washington. It's helped us in a number of areas, not the least of which is our reforms have helped us create a better business environment, which has led to more jobs in our state. The first 6 months of this year, we saw nearly 40,000 new jobs created in the state of Wisconsin. That's out of a state obviously a lot smaller than Illinois, about 5.6 million people. We took action right away. Scott mentioned this in the introduction. Even before some of the reforms that probably got most of our attention, in January leading into February, we had massive changes, much of which included not only Republicans in the legislature, but many of what I would call the discerning Democrats in the legislature that voted with us on tort reform, regulatory reform, tax incentives for job creators specifically tied into job growth, repealed the state tax on health savings accounts, even taking away what formerly had been the Department of Commerce, which used to be a state agency that was in part about promoting commerce, but also about regulating commerce, and instead we replaced it with what's now called the Wisconsin Economic Development Corporation, a public-private entity whose sole purpose is promoting commerce in the state of Wisconsin. Obviously, we've got some Viking fans here. I said along the way, we get a few people along the way who think that their voices are a little bit different than others out there. But along the way, I said we've got some... The interesting thing is, throughout all this, and we're used to this, I said you get a few folks who aren't. Hey! All right. We are...
Oh my gosh. Thanks for dropping by. It was great having you. Ladies and gentlemen, this is what free expression is all about, and sometimes it's very messy. All right. You're welcome. Okay. All right, well, I'm going to take out a few of the questions from those tables. You think? I mean, 'cause Scott, I think they've had their shot. Ladies and gentlemen, Scott Walker.
Thank you. Well, I think if I needed to make the case earlier this year that a lot of the people in the state capitol in Madison weren't from Wisconsin, point made. The bottom line is, no matter how loud you shout, the facts are the facts. And the facts are that our reforms have worked. And they continue to work in the state of Wisconsin. In our case, when you talk about jobs, the number one issue in our state, in this state, all across America, our reforms have worked. You look at what we did early on this year, what we did in particular in that special session on jobs that included votes from both Republican and Democrat lawmakers, changed the business environment in our state so much so that we saw nearly 40,000 new jobs in the first 6 months of the year. And we saw on two significant measures, hope for the future, that we're going to add even more jobs in Wisconsin and help lead the country out of the economic challenges we face today. One of them was internal. Every year, the statewide Chamber of Commerce does a survey of job creators, big and small, around our state. And every year, it's an interesting mix of challenges out there. A year ago in Wisconsin, literally 10% of all the job creators surveyed in our state said Wisconsin was heading in the right direction. 10%. This year, after several months of our reforms going into effect in our state, that number went from 10% to 88%. 88% of the job creators in our state said Wisconsin's heading in the right direction. And the good news in that survey wasn't just their feelings, was the fact that they said, a solid majority said in the next 12 months, they're going to add more jobs in the state of Wisconsin. Now, externally, that's worked as well. Across America, every year, there's all sorts of rankings that talk about the best and the worst states to do business in. For years, historically, we didn't talk in Wisconsin about those surveys because we were ranked somewhere between 40 and 50 on the list. In fact, 2 years ago, we were 43. Last year, we were 41. This year, again, after several months of our reforms being fully implemented, putting into effect to show that we created a better environment for creating jobs in our state, we went from 41 up to 24, 17 spots, the fastest increase in any state in the country. The fastest increase actually in the history of that CO survey. Why? Because we're doing things to make it easier to create jobs. And despite what others might say out there, government doesn't create jobs. People create jobs. And so we're trying to make it easier for the people of Wisconsin, the people that want to come into Wisconsin, the people that want to grow in Wisconsin, to create jobs in our state. Beyond just jobs, though, it's working in other ways. It's interesting. You know, it's a lot of banter, not only in this morning's session, but around our state, of folks who don't want the truth to get out. I found it kind of amusing to be referenced in the same vein as Rahm Emanuel, the mayor, but really some of the reforms he's trying to do here echo the things we tried to do in the state of Wisconsin, and I give him credit for that. Despite the fact I'm a Republican, he's a Democrat, whether it's him, whether it's Governor Cuomo, a Democrat in New York, or even Jerry Brown the other day out in California, the reality is we cannot ignore the situations we're in. We cannot pass on the burden to the next generation and ignore the realities of the fiscal crisis we face today. In our case, the reason why others are doing some of the same things we initiated earlier this year, again, is because it's working. In our state, we had a $3.6 billion budget deficit. In fact, 2 years ago, we had one of the largest structural deficits ever. The budget I signed into law at the end of June that took effect July 1 of this year actually turns a $3.6 billion budget deficit in January into a $300 million surplus at the end of our biennium. We made tough but needed decisions, structural changes, that weren't just about rating one-time federal stimulus aid, that weren't about rating things like the transportation or the patient's compensation fund, were about making meaningful structural changes that helped us to balance our budget for generations to come. And the changes we made for local government, because the largest single portion of our state budget is aid to local government. Unlike nearly every other state across the country, there are more than 40 states, Illinois included, that had budget deficits this past year. And governors across the country, Republican and Democrat alike, have had to make billions of dollars of cuts, not only to state government, to the university systems, to schools and local governments. The difference in Wisconsin, and why so many others are trying to replicate the changes we made, whether it's Rahm Emanuel in part here in Chicago, whether it's Deval Patrick, a Democrat in Massachusetts, whether it's Jerry Brown out in California, is because, again, you have to make structural changes to get things back on track. In our case, what we did, what was unique, was we didn't just adjust aid to local governments, we gave our local governments the tools to balance those changes. By making changes in collective bargaining, which, by the way, is not a right. If it was a right, Barack Obama, as President of the United States, would invoke that for federal employees. But many, not all of you may not know this, federal employees do not have collective bargaining for wages and benefits. They didn't have them before, they don't have them under Barack Obama. In fact, federal employees pay on average 28% for the health insurance premium, which is twice the amount I've asked from state and local government employees. So for all the people who are hyped up about it, I don't see any protests at the White House. Yet what the president has in place for the federal government employees is less generous than what I asked from state and local employees in the state of Wisconsin. In our case, giving our school districts and our local governments the tools to balance their budget, to ask a little bit from everyone who works in government like myself. I match my pension contribution just like, actually I pay more. I pay a higher percentage than average employees pay in the state of Wisconsin. I match my pension contribution just like others do now under these new reforms. We pay a percentage of our premium for our health insurance, although at 12.6%, that is still well below the roughly 20% health insurance premium on average that the middle class taxpayers in our state pay. So what we've asked for is not outrageous. In fact, in some ways, it's still more generous than neighbors on either side who work outside of government. But by doing that, we have saved hundreds, literally hundreds of millions of dollars. And on top of the pension and health care contribution, by changing collective bargaining so that schools and others could open up the market and actually buy health insurance instead of being dictated to what company they have to buy it from, that alone has changed many of our districts from our small ones who've saved hundreds of thousands to a district like Appleton, just south of Green Bay, who not long ago was able to renegotiate their contract because of our reforms and save over $3 million just from a health care change alone. Not from added pension, or not from added premium payments, but just out of changing because we opened the marketplace up there. That in turn is paid off not in terms of balancing budgets, but in how we operate our government. You see, in December when we get our property tax bills all across Wisconsin, the vast majority of our local jurisdictions are going to send property tax bills to the taxpayers that are the same or lower than they were the year before. That's powerful, particularly in a tough economy. For the next 2 years, we have an effective property tax freeze in place. But most importantly, we get to change the way we run government. You see, a great example of this is Kaukauna, another one of those school districts just down the way, Green Bay. Kaukauna was a mid-sized district, school district, that was anticipating about a $400,000 deficit. They used the tools we gave them, they used the reforms we passed earlier this year, and they took that $400,000 deficit and turned it into more than $1 million surplus. And you know what they used that money for? They hired more teachers. They lowered the classroom size. They ultimately set about $300,000 aside to pay based on merit in the future. You see, the best part of the reforms isn't just that we balance the budget in a structurally sound way that makes sure that my kids and all the other kids in Wisconsin will inherit a Wisconsin that is financially sound and stable for generations to come. It's not just that we created a better business environment so that more people can create jobs and opportunity in the state. It's not even because we're going to freeze property taxes for property taxpayers all across Wisconsin. I think the most important thing we did reform-wise was ultimately empower our state and our local governments to make government work better. When you can hire and fire, not based on tenure or seniority, but instead based on merit. When you can set money aside to pay your employees based on performance, imagine that. Something that works pretty well in the private sector all the time. Pay based on performance, what you will have is the best and the brightest in the classrooms and in government positions all across our state. That's the true change. That's the real reform that ultimately will make government work better. We can put in place things that say, If you perform to these standards, if you provide excellent customer service, if you provide savings for the taxpayers, if you do all these things, we're going to pay you based on the merit, based on the performance that you provided for the taxpayers of our state or of your jurisdiction. That's where you bring fundamental change to government. And that, to me, is probably one of the most exciting things out there. It was interesting along the way, early on after our reforms passed, I'd get little bits of pro, or little bits against, and then sometimes I get somebody pro. But I always was amazed. I'd come up to events, and I could always tell when a school teacher was going to come up to talk to me who was favorable, because he or she would look both ways first, and then they quietly whisper, "But I support what you're doing." And then when I talked to them, it was almost always because their spouse, husband or wife, depending on who it was someone who worked outside of government. In fact, in many cases, it was someone who had their own business, maybe a small business, a contractor or something like that. And they knew. In fact, I had a guy the other day who told me he was a remodeling business. And because the economy was tough, his wife had decided instead of working with him at the business, she decided to go back to teaching. And when she went back, some of the folks in the teachers union had said to her, "Well, you're going to have to pay over 12% for your health insurance." And she said, "That's great. I pay 100% right now." So it's one of those where I heard from that early on, but on the latter point of making government work better, what I saw in August, both of my kids go to public schools just outside of Milwaukee. I've got a junior and senior in high school, and it was interesting because in August, as teachers were going back to get ready for the start of the school year on September 1, I had more and more teachers come up to me who weren't just saying that, but were saying, "You know what? We're back at school now, and it's exciting. All the people who are here now want to be. They're excited about being here. We've got the best talent. We've got a great relationship. We're able to talk directly to our principal. We don't have to worry about union contracts and everything else. We can actually do what we care about, which is teaching our kids, being focused on it, and everybody who's teaching with us wants to be here for the same reasons." That's inspiring, because in the end, that's going to help, again, not just balance the budget, that's going to help make our schools and our local governments and our state government operate that much better. Now, an interesting contrast isn't so much between Wisconsin and Chicago, because again, your mayor, not all, but is doing some of the same things, because he, like many others, understand that you can't look this in the face and not make some serious changes. Really, I say changes that think more about the next generation than we think about the next election. That's the litmus test we had, is think more about the next generation than you do about the next election. But I'd like for a second just to contrast Wisconsin with Illinois, not with Chicago, but with Illinois. I mean, think about that earlier this year. The folks down in Springfield said boldly, "We're not going to do what Wisconsin's doing. We're not going to consider what Wisconsin's considering." So what did they do to balance their budget deficit down in Springfield? They raised taxes. They raised taxes on individuals by 67%. They raised taxes on employers, the very people that we want to create more jobs, by 46%. Now, Mitch Daniels, who's the governor, obviously, over in Indiana, and I kind of jumped down here into Chicago. I pulled out, I have the sticker I show all the time, "Wisconsin's open for business." That day I brought down a different one. I brought an old tourism slogan that we had in Wisconsin years ago that was a sticker that said, for folks from Illinois in particular to come up to all the great spots we've got in Wisconsin to vacation in, I had a sticker that said, "Escape to Wisconsin," because that's what I said for any job creator or anybody who wants to add jobs. The right answer, and believe me, every week, nearly every week, I've got a new opening up in Kenosha County and Pleasant Prairie and other places like that. Any of you looking to grow and expand and get to a safer state, come right on up, whether it's in Rock County or Kenosha or Racine or anywhere else out there. But it was interesting. We predicted a year later, because the folks in Springfield failed to make the tough decisions. We predicted a year later you'd back at it, raising taxes yet again, suffering through the same challenges. I got to tell you, I was wrong. It was less than a year. It was about a half a year later. And you saw a few months ago the talk about after all that hype, after all those high tax increases, that instead of producing a balanced budget, you had a multi-billion-dollar budget deficit. And so you've got the folks in Springfield talking about laying off thousands of public employees, talking about closing down numerous state facilities, all because they failed to make the tough decisions. Ironically, for all the hype and for all the protests, we didn't have any massive layoffs. We protected middle-class jobs. We protected middle-class property taxpayers because we said we were going to make structural changes that make Wisconsin a better place to live in, to grow in, to invest in, and to add jobs in. Now, that's an interesting contrast because remember that ranking I talked about that moved us up 17 states as a place that job creators want to go to? That same ranking in the last 5 years has seen Illinois drop 40 spots. fact, the Wall Street Journal, when they commented on it, called it a death spiral. Because there's a failure in Springfield to make tough decisions. In Springfield, you've got a state government that has the 49th worst bond rating. In fact, if it weren't for California, it'd be a league of its own. Our bond rating is stable in Wisconsin. In fact, Moody's, one of those bond rating agencies, literally called our budget credit positive. You look along the way, we've got a pension system for our state employees that's 100% funded. It's not even half funded down in Springfield. There are some clear challenges out there. And what I like to point out is that it really, even in the midst of what may come up in terms of some of those protesters who are going to go up and try and join with some of the people from Wisconsin in terms of a recall, I opened the door to that. I said, I'd love to have that debate. Because for 2 months, while people are circulating that, I'm going to tell the people of Wisconsin how our reforms are working. And with all due respect to people in Illinois, I'm going to use Illinois as a good example of where in Wisconsin, either we can go forward, it's our state motto, we can go forward and invoke reforms, continue to push forward reforms that create more jobs in the private sector, that ultimately balance our state and local budgets in ways that are long-term, not short-term, lower property taxes for our property taxpayers, both residential and small businesses, and ultimately have a government that works better, or we can go down the path that we see down in Springfield, where in our view that would be going backwards. That's the choice before us. Now, the last thing I just say, and then we can open up to some of the questions you've collected, is that this is an important discussion, not only in Madison or our state capital, not only down in Springfield here in Illinois, but I think in state houses all across America. And I think even more so in our nation's capital in Washington, D.C. You see, over time, about a month ago I spoke at a governor's conference in Philadelphia, and Tonette and I, my wife and I, snuck over to the Constitution Hall and saw the Liberty Bell, and then went into Constitution Hall, which is actually about a little bit smaller, but not much than the room we're standing in right now. And I always love looking at places like that because it's a good reminder that as much as, through all the years, I loved history in school and still do, and you always kind of lift up guys like Washington and Franklin and others as kind of the untouchables. I mean, just bigger than life. But you stood in that room in Philadelphia and you look around, and you think of all the people who worked on it, Jefferson and Franklin and all the others who were there, and you think back some 224 years ago when they put together the Constitution for the United States, and you realize these were regular people. These are people just like all of us here today. Ordinary people who did extraordinary things. But what has been great about our nation's history, not just back then in Philadelphia, but throughout all the years of more than 2 centuries, what has made our country great is in times of crisis, be it fiscal or economic or military or social, whatever it might be, all throughout this exceptional nation's history, is in times of crisis we've had men and women who were leaders, who stood up and decided to make decisions that were more about their children's and their grandchildren's future than they were about their own political futures. This is one of those moments in our nation's history. This is one of those moments when we have to decide truly, are we going to make decisions that think more about the next generation than they do about the next election? And the thing I have people like all of you here today and others across not only Illinois and Wisconsin, but across America, is we ultimately have to decide that if we have men and women of courage who are in elected offices who are willing to take on the tough choices and willing to face the attacks and the abuse and everything else that comes with that, are we willing to stand up with those men and women and say, you know what? We're willing to stand shoulder to shoulder, arm to arm, and say, it's about time we start thinking about the future, not just the present. Thanks so much for allowing me to share. We'll take some questions.
Let's hear it.